Mr. O'Connor.
Okay, from Lady. Ms McNamara, I want to turn now and ask you a series of questions about what you describe in your witness statement as narrowed perspectives on the part of decision makers, and it's something we've touched on during the morning. The consequence of some of the behaviours and narrowed understanding, lack of real life experience that you observed on the part of those in Downing Street. And you'll recall that we looked at that paragraph of your statement where you brought together those themes which you thought were represented in the issue about prison releases. And one of the themes that you refer to there was a general lack of knowledge or understanding on the part of decision makers of how large parts of the state operate. And with that in mind, I'd like to ask you some questions about understanding of the NHS on the part of Boris Johnson, his ministers, and so on. The NHS, which of course was of such central importance to the pandemic. As we've heard, the lockdown was caused by an understanding that there was a need to prevent the NHS being overwhelmed. So with that in mind, could we look please at page 39 of your witness statement? It's paragraph 71. And the context is you're discussing challenges and debates within the Cabinet Office about the NHS and so on. But I want to pick it up about 5 or 6 lines from the bottom. Do you see it says, I do not remember anyone working in the centre or who was part of the conversations who had a detailed understanding of the way the NHS operated. This is not unusual or unique to that time. Social policy and the operational management of the state is always underrepresented in the centre of power, whereas the Treasury, foreign policy and national security are overrepresented. Just going back to the first sentence, you say you don't remember anyone working in the centre or who was part of those conversations who had a detailed understanding of the way the NHS operated. Yeah. Given all we've heard about the importance of the NHS, and not just in terms of caring for people, but the detail, whether it was going to be overwhelmed or not, that's a very striking statement.
Yes, it was an observation at the time and is striking in retrospect as well. I think it probably goes to what needs to be different in the future, is that it oughtn't be to be possible to kind of start from that primary level of ignorance. It causes problems, and it was something we felt very strongly at the time, that just actually having people who were literate in the NHS would have been more useful.
No doubt there were attempts to educate the Prime Minister, his advisors, his ministers in the way the NHS worked, and we've seen, for example, Simon Stevens came to meetings, of course, Chris Whitty. But was that a sticking plaster that did the job, or do you think there was still a deficit that actually led to imperfections in policy decisions?
I think if you were starting again, you might think quite differently about what is the skills and expertise and knowledge that ought to be available immediately for a Prime Minister to help support them on the business of the day, whatever it is. So, for example, there's been a military attaché in the Prime Minister's private office for a very long time, for very good reasons, because when the Prime Minister is taking decisions which relate to the deployment of the military, then having somebody who can sit right by the side of the Prime Minister and translate and explain and bridge that gap is very important and useful. I'm not my place, and I wouldn't be suggesting there need to be a series of attachés. What I'm saying is that I think this is an endemic problem, that having more actual operational and detailed experience of important things for our country, it'd be better if the Prime Minister could have those in-house, as well as, yes, absolutely always should be relying on the Chief Medical Officer and the Secretary of State for Health, because what, in my view, you don't want Number 10 or the Cabinet Office ever to be is a sort of mini replication of the entirety of Whitehall, good government works when everybody is doing their jobs well and the centre is doing its job well, and trying to recreate everything in the centre of Whitehall, as I think probably this experience shows in a pretty gruesome way, does not work.
Let me shift focus just a little bit, still on narrowed perspectives, but now on that type of narrowed perspectives where there is a failure properly to consider certain groups within society. And before turning to specifics, let me take you to one general observation you make. It's on page 53 of your statement, at the bottom, paragraph 106. And you say this: I remember at the time feeling as if while there was undoubtedly sympathy, and I think you're talking about sympathy amongst the decision makers, sympathy for the differential impacts on women, poorer people, how COVID was disproportionately harming black and Asian communities. When it was raised, it was treated as if these were naturally occurring phenomena rather than the consequences of deliberate choices, albeit often historic. And you do not think the impacts on women and children were properly appreciated even much later in the process. It's that term, naturally occurring phenomena, that stands out. And can you explain what you mean by that?
So what I mean is I think there wasn't a sufficient understanding that government, in the way that it was making decisions at that time, was either compounding or correcting inequality. And I don't think there was enough understanding of the impact of what the government does or how our country works in the day-to-day, and then enough of a questioning look at whether the decisions and actions of the government were making that worse or better. And I mean, that might not have been the way that other people would phrase it, but I would, that there wasn't enough mindfulness about trying to address inequality as opposed to sort of compounding it without really noticing.
So perhaps there was not an understanding that what the choices the government made, just as in the same way as historic choices that earlier governments had made, was actually driving this change.
Yes.
Now, we spoke earlier about the reports you did, the evidence you took, if you like, about the over-talking of women in the Cabinet Office, the fact they weren't present at meetings, and so on. And I said we would come back to the causation issue, if you like, of what effect you thought that was actually having, quite apart from on policies, quite apart from the effect it was having on those concerned. And perhaps we can look, please, at page 103 of your statement, on page 52. And you, in this paragraph, you detail a series of policy areas which you think were affected. You say, in terms of the policy response, that the exclusion of a female perspective led to significant negative consequences, including the lack of thought given to childcare in the context of school closures, a serious lack of thinking about domestic abuse and the vulnerable, about carers and informal networks for how people look after each other in families and communities. You also say insufficient thinking about single parents, alongside a disproportionate thinking about shooting and football. And you also mention a lack of guidance for women who might be pregnant, and so on. So, at the moment, dealing with those things sort of cumulatively, can you tell us a little bit more about your concerns at the time?
I could see that not only was it that decisions were being made that didn't think about these impacts, that the sort of absence from the room was even more problematic. That I didn't actually believe that decision makers were willfully and deliberately deciding to cause harm to particular groups, but that it wasn't even considered was a real problem. And I should say, I mean, I've talked a lot about women in this statement, but the issue of ethnicity and the divergent impact of COVID on different communities was something that we were really concerned about at the time as well.
Well, let's just come to that now, because and so if we can look, please, at tab 53 of the bundle, and it's document 286042. What we can see is this is another response, isn't it, to that email we looked at earlier about women at the centre. I think we saw Catherine Hammond's response before lunch, but this is a different one from another civil servant called Alexandra Burns. And in the first paragraph, she addresses your email about impact on women and so on. But then she goes on, and we'll note that this is still just the 13th of April, to say, separately, I feel like there's an issue bubbling on another equality dimension, race. Lots of discussion starting publicly about the fact it seems to be hitting ethnic minorities harder. She doesn't know whether it's true or not, although she clearly thinks it may well be. She can understand the problem. But then she says, do you know if there is any work looking at this at all at the moment? Tell us, is that something that you took forward or that you were aware that others took forward?
So this is a not uncommon moment when another of the private secretaries in number 10 is really identifying a problem and highlighting it quite helpfully. I think she was the first person to really start to worry and raise this as an issue. From what I recall, she and I then spoke about it. She explained a bit more what she was worried about. And I think, but I'd have to check the record again, I think we started with the data and trying to get a better understanding of the data, and then trying to, in lots of ways, that was the way in which to try to highlight a problem or an issue at the time. But it's another good example of her doing that.
Again, it wouldn't have been your role personally to have investigated these matters, but to have made sure that other people were.
Yes. So quite often, I think, as you will see through the record, what I'm doing is hearing about something, someone's raising an issue with me, and then I am working out where to put it and how to make sure that we are, as always, trying to do our best efforts and think in the biggest way possible. So that's probably how I try to work in general, and it's definitely given very little of this was actually under my kind of operational management. It was one of the things that I thought was how I could contribute the most at the time.
Switching back, if we may, because we were talking about issues about women and those lists of issues that you felt being overlooked. This is again something that you sent emails about, took action about at the time. So if we could go, please, to tab 37 of the bundle, and it's 308302. An email you sent 10 days or so after the email we were just looking at, towards the end of April. And you say that you think that we should make a list of all the things that have happened because of lack of gender diversity in decision makers. It isn't enough that we keep observing this phenomenon. It doesn't matter if the political team haven't asked or don't seem interested. As civil servants, we have a responsibility to find a way of building this input in so that the country gets the best outcome that isn't optional, and so on. And then you start by making a list of issues which mirrors some of the points that are in your witness statement. Confusion about access to abortion, guidance on pregnancy, and the second one, not making provision for victims of domestic abuse. So do we see here you trying to start a process of bringing these issues more to light?
I think, so this is an email to Cara Escott, as she said. So she is another great example of people who run towards a problem. So she's actually she had been the Principal Private Secretary to the previous Cabinet Secretary, and she's one of the people who stepped up and volunteered to help. So this is a person I know quite well, which is probably why the tone of the email is quite brusque, I think. I certainly wasn't criticising her. I think far from it. I think what has happened here is that she and I have had a conversation. We've thought that raising things was enough. And then now I'm thinking that from what she's just said to me, it's not enough. And so we think about, what do we do now? And this whole time, as is pretty normal in the civil service, you try something and then it doesn't work, so you try something else and you try something else. And I think that's what she and I are trying to do here. And then she, who at the time was working in the team who were providing the advice on COVID, was making sure from her perspective, as far as she could, that these considerations were baked into the advice and thinking.
And the theme of this email is, as you say, it's not enough just to notice these problems or even to talk about them. We've got to do something about them. Was further action taken going forward on these issues, either by you or by others?
So by her, yes. And I'm pretty sure the record will show that in terms of what then started to feature in the advice that came from the task force.
Yeah. One of the issues we see listed there, which you have referred to more than once in your statement, is the question of domestic abuse. And I think in another email you said that you thought it was very likely that people had died because not enough had been done to think about how to address the problems that group faced. I'm not going to take you to it, but do you recall that?
I do recall that. I think that was me reacting to a cabinet minute where I think the Prime Minister had said that no one had been harmed or something like that, and I felt that wasn't, the cabinet minute needs to be accurate, and I was concerned about, obviously, that I thought domestic abuse was sadly bound to have increased. And I think that it's one of those areas where if we'd have just had a month more or 6 weeks more, and the sort of people that think properly about these issues in the centre of Whitehall, of which there were many, then we might have been able to do something that mitigated that harm. And that is one of the things that, it's obviously awful that we were not able to think ahead enough in advance, and that then all those people came to further harm.
Just pursuing that issue a little further, if we can look at paragraph 45 of your statement, please, on page 25. So it's the bottom page, in fact, I think the bottom 4 lines. Do you have it?
Yes.
You say, I remember it being far too difficult to get people to pay attention to domestic violence and lockdown. The number 10 Private Secretary Hannah Young having to push back against the assertion that it was not an urgent problem because it was, quotes, not showing up in the data. And you say it's only because of her relentless pushing of the issue that there was eventually a summit on hidden harms. That's precisely the kind of thing you say, as you've said now, where with even weeks more to plan, it may have been possible to avert that harm.
Yes, and I think it's also, people don't want to think about these things. So you don't want to think that awful things happen to children and partners and parents in their own home. And if you are a kind of more experienced civil servant or somebody who's worked in lots of, you have a different sense, unfortunately, of these things. And I think it goes to who is involved in advising and decision making, and are they able to bring the kind of full gamut of what the state actually knows about what sometimes happens. And I feel that it was quite lopsided at this point. We were looking at harm through a very narrow lens without realising that, of course, there can be all sorts of other consequences of things you can't see.
And one of the phrases you used in that part of your statement was that this issue wasn't considered because it was, quotes, not showing up in the data. And another theme of your witness statement is this idea of, well, what is a countable thing? What should we be restricting our concern to so-called countable things, or should we be thinking more broadly? And if we can look at another document, which is tab 11 of the bundle, 286019. We see here another of your emails, again from April, where you are trying, I suggest, to capture a series of these either non-countable or less countable things, and saying, let's put these on the dashboard alongside hospital beds, deaths, and so on. And just to pick up on what you said a moment ago, is this the type of thinking that you would have liked to have done if there had been another month or two to prepare for the pandemic?
Yes, absolutely. So this is an email to Mark Sweeney, who was running the Economic and Domestic Secretariat. And if he and his team had been able to spend a bit more time, they would have been able, I'm confident, to have bottomed out all of the other questions we ought to be considering. This isn't a perfect list. And again, I'm looking at a pretty hurried and conversational piece of work rather than something very, very profound and thoughtful. But I definitely thought that from very early on we were looking at the wrong indicators, or rather that there were many, many, many more signs of both what was happening and what the government was doing that we ought to be bearing in mind when we were making decisions. And it was sort of gave false comfort to keep on getting ever more precise data about a particular set of things. That is not to say that I don't think both that there was inadequate data, that was definitely true, and that data matters, it definitely does. But it was more that I thought that we were perhaps, as I say, not just focusing on countable things and also possibly counting the wrong things.
Yeah. Just one more area in this narrowed perspective, and that's the question of PPE for women. Another issue that you tried to drive forward. If we could look, please, at page 53 of your statement, paragraph 104. Towards the bottom of that paragraph, you say that you raised issues about the inadequacies of PPE for women and tried to make sure that this was taken into account in any new supply. And you record that the Prime Minister, I don't know whether this was at your suggestion or not, raised this issue with Simon Stevens, who, as we know, is the Chief Executive, I think, of the NHS, on April the 30th. And he, that is Simon Stevens, reassured the Prime Minister that the issues with PPE fitting women's bodies had been misreported and there wasn't a problem.
Yes.
Is that something were you there at that meeting, or were
yes.
you told about it? And was it because of your suggestion that this was raised?
So I wouldn't want to claim single credit at all. So I had definitely raised this issue a number of times, and it was, I presume, the COVID, or the team who were working on COVID before they were the task force who had asked the Prime Minister to raise that. I wouldn't have been involved in writing the briefing. But I do remember feeling that I couldn't, once we got to that point, there wasn't much more I could do to keep on pressing this point, because if he thought it was fine, then that's sort of the end of the road, really.
Just noticing and remembering that date of the 30th of April as being the date on which this meeting you understood took place. Let's look at one other document, please. And it's tab 21 in the bundle, 286059. And we need to go to at least the second page to see the start of the email chain. And we see it starts with an email from you, another email you sent during April, another pursuing of a separate issue. You're emailing Simon and Mary. Remind us who they are. Simon Ridley and Mary Jones.
Yes.
Seems you at least thought that you'd sent a number of annoying emails to colleagues during that period.
Yes.
But you raise with them the question of whether this issue of PPE not being designed for female bodies had, as it were, been considered by those who were sourcing PPE in those early days of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And we see both responses that we get back. First of all, from Mary Jones, "Hi Helen, I haven't heard it discussed at the top level meetings. Simon will be much better informed than me." And then if we go back to the first page, the response from Simon Ridley, just tell us who was Simon Ridley?
So the contribution Simon Ridley made during this whole period is genuinely extraordinary, I think. And Simon had been a Director General in DEXI, the Department for Exiting the European Union, and he's one of the people that sort of went straight from that into being involved in this nascent Cabinet Office team. I think at this point, Simon was maybe running the NHS MIG. I say sorry, I'm not. But I think he was running one of the cabinet committee groups at that point, and he was been involved because he was involved, I think, in the procurement of new PPE as well.
Later in the year, he became one of the heads, or the head of the COVID task force.
I think much later after, yes, so he was the Director General, then he worked for Simon Case, and then he worked for James Bowler, and I think after James Bowler as a Permanent Secretary left, then I think Simon became the Permanent Secretary then, yep. Yes.
In any event, here's his response back in April to your email about PPE for women. He says, "Thanks for raising this. I'll be honest, it's not something that's been in conversations I've had thus far. That's not to say it isn't in the thinking, but I will assume not really, and take it up." And he emphasises that diversity is important.
Yeah.
And then if we look at the top of the page, we can see it's 2 weeks later, on the 30th of April, the day we saw of the meeting with Simon Stevens, that Cleo Watson, who I think was another of the officials in Downing Street.
She was the Deputy Chief of Staff, yes.
Who says, astonishing, 2 weeks later, and finally raised in one of these meetings. What do you think she meant by astonishing? Astonishing at how long it had taken?
So she and I had been talking about this all the way throughout as well, and it would be unfair to create the impression that what she's doing here is criticising Simon and Mary, both of whom I'd worked with extensively, and have every confidence that what they were doing was trying to get the thing addressed. I think the reason, but I am speculating rather than knowing, and the documents would tell you, is that the reason why eventually it had to go to the Prime Minister to ask the question is because they had tried any other route to get the answer, and then using a Prime Minister in a meeting to ask a question shouldn't be your first response if you want to know the answer. It's the point you get to if you can't find any other way of getting through the system. And I suspect that's what Cleo means here. She and I had lots of conversations about this. And in fact, everybody on this email chain are people for whom were concerned about the differential impacts on women and were trying to do something about it, in my view.
So, Ms McNamara, here are a whole series of issues, all of them linked to this question of narrowed perspectives, which you were raising in April, and we've been through them, and to a varying degree, you were able to get others to take them on. Looking forward, perhaps to the next pandemic, it's obvious from what you've said that you would hope that the Cabinet Office would have more time to think these things through. But beyond that, how should the government, do you think, ensure that the interests of ethnic minority people, disabled people, women, are more properly taken into account in this sort of situation?
So I think I'd say two things. Firstly, that I think you've heard some great and interesting things in your first module about how government should be ready for crisis response. And I would hope that the suggestion that I think Mr. Letwin made about creating a bit of machinery that had that responsibility of auditing and managing plans and managing risk, that you would want that unit to have that question as one of the things that it was asking, not just are we ready and have we got enough of this thing in that warehouse, but have we thought sufficiently about the impact? I think that there are legal frameworks that could be in place that I believe would equip for better decision making in terms of this sort of emergency again. And I also think this is really about normal civil service work. So in my experience as a civil servant, it is just normal, and actually it's legally required of you in terms of an equality impact assessment to make sure that the work you are doing, that you understand the impact that it's going to have. Now, those things can be laborious, and the answer to everything isn't let's have another piece of law about it. But I do feel you have to have structural forcing mechanisms that don't let you not notice the impact of the decisions that you're making, and that matters even in a crisis. And I also think there's a whole host of other things about culture and behaviours and the structures and the people and the skills and experience that are around a Prime Minister that I hope will be better, because that's what we collectively all need to do, is just make sure it's better next time.
Thank you. Finally, I've got 3 further short points I want to ask you about, which don't have much of a common theme, really. The first is about overwhelming the NHS. It's been a recurring theme, and as I've said, the risk, the apprehension of overwhelming the NHS was one of the reasons that the lockdown decision was taken. Of course, if one is facing a population level pandemic and one is talking about hundreds, even 500,000, 750,000 deaths, it's easy to say in that situation the NHS will be overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. What's harder to do is to calibrate where below that the NHS overwhelm point is, if I can put it that way. And this is something that you address in your statement at page 89, paragraph 181. Thank you. So I think we might need to go back to the page before, just to the start of that paragraph. And you say it was difficult to get the right kind of engagement from DHSC or the NHS. There was an inbuilt reluctance to accept that it was possible to get to a point where the NHS was overwhelmed, and or to acknowledge that this would be something that Number 10 and the Prime Minister would need to be across. And you reference to concern that help from the Cabinet Office might not be helpful. And you say you kept being told that the NHS capacity was elastic. And then later on, a couple of lines down, you say, it was only much later that I realised that what was meant by NHS capacity being elastic was the capacity of people working in the NHS to work themselves into the ground to keep people alive. So were you in fact ever able to get to the bottom of this question of what we mean by the overwhelming of the NHS?
So this is in the following winter. So this is the winter of 2020-21 when, and this is a place where I was much more actively involved in managing what we saw as, well, which were concurrent and compound risks of what was going to be happening in the winter of 2021. So most of the work I did in relation to COVID in the autumn was around thinking about how we just could not possibly, I couldn't bear it if we were in the same position as we had been in the spring. And we created a small team in the Cabinet Office to manage these winter pressures. This was the winter when we were going to practically be managing through the impact of leaving the European Union. And the CDL in particular was really clear on how we needed to manage these things together and gave us some great political leadership at that period to try to manage the concurrent risks. Winter for government anyway, and I had experience of this previously in the Cabinet Office you quite often have to do winter readiness exercises because the severe weather plus the NHS in normal times can get overwhelmed. It's a pretty normal, I would say, thing for the Cabinet Office and for government to focus on. So sorry, I just wanted to set out that context, because then there was at the same time this concern that I had, probably again thinking back to March, of how would we be able to identify the point at which we thought that it was likely the NHS got overwhelmed? And was this going to be in a particular geography? So was it going to be about, because we had all learnt a bit more about how the NHS operates at this point, but was it going to be about it just wouldn't be possible for there to be enough ambulances and enough emergency beds in a particular place so that people could safely be looked after? Or was it going to be a system risk? All of these pretty normal questions. I mean, I go on into some of the detail in my statement, but the thing I was finding really difficult is that it was very, very, well, it was just impossible to get anybody to quantify that, to say we will know 2 weeks before we hit an absolute crisis point that we are heading for a crisis point, and then what is our plan B? And partly because, as I'm sure anybody would understand, if you've been through that experience that some of us had been, we just were really possibly, I don't think it was over-concerned, but we were extremely concerned about seeking to do whatever we could do to try to avoid this problem. And my reflection about it being the people is after I left that I understood it more. And I think the other thing about the NHS being elastic is the NHS is much more than just acute care and acute hospitals. And it had been my experience of working in government for a long time that when people, when the institution of the NHS tends to focus and talk much more about that than it does about public health or GPs or all of those other things. And I think, again, looking back, I think we weren't concerned enough about the kind of actual overall health of the population, as opposed to what we would do if there were ambulances queued up outside 3 hospitals in the same geography. So, sorry, I think it's just a slightly broader point.
It's all very helpful. Let me move on and ask you about a different issue, and that's children. There's a passage in your statement, I'm not going to take you to it, where you describe the issues around the grading disputes for exams in the summer of 2020. The problem emerging in Scotland and then happening in England. Apparently, no one had really thought about trying to address the problem in light of the Scottish experience in England. Let me take you, though, at least to paragraph 164 of your statement, page 81, I think. This is the sort of the conclusion of that process, because I think it's right to say you did some work to try and understand what had happened, and you sent some people into the Department for Education to try and assist with that.
So this is when the Cabinet Secretary was away before the new Cabinet Secretary was appointed. So
yes.
That's partly why I was doing it.
Exactly. So I think, if we can go on to the next page, in the end, as a result of all of what happened, and you describe it in your witness statement, you say you thought in the circumstances it was untenable for the Secretary of State, I think you mean Gavin Williamson, to continue in post, but you could understand the argument for leaving him there for a short while until the schools had returned. And that's what Simon Case relayed about what the Prime Minister intended to do. So do we take it that, on your evidence, your understanding was that Gavin Williamson would not remain the Education Secretary, at least for any length of time at that point?
Yes, that was what I was told, and that was in relation to the fact that the Permanent Secretary had effectively had to resign, and it felt that if that was the case, then I was told the same thing was going to be true for the Secretary of State.
Yeah. So exams, you also address the question of schools closing, not closing in early 2021. But more broadly, are these 2 incidents, examples of a deeper problem, that the interests of children, and no doubt their parents and others they're associated with, weren't properly considered alongside all those other interests that we've been discussing.
Yes, and I think it's the invisibility which is my concern about that. It's because you can't see the problem that you are creating in the future, if you like. And I think one of the responsibilities of good government is to do that, is to make 20 years' problem today's issue to be addressed. And it felt that that wasn't really material. I also think, going back to my narrowed perspective point, it was really striking at the time for those of us who have children in state schools, like the vast majority of the country, that the differential experience of some children and other children, and I would, my children are obviously, fortunate in so many other ways that in terms of the access they have, and there wasn't enough thinking about the overall experience of children who might not have quite the same privileges as the people who are in rooms in Whitehall taking decisions. And I think it's related a little bit to my point about domestic abuse, is that you just shouldn't, as a state, as a government, be able to not know and understand the whole population in your decision making, particularly the people who are outside of your day-to-day experience. And that causes problems if you think that your life is the same as everybody else's. And it's kind of fine to do that as an individual, but institutionally it's really wrong.
The last of these three topics, Ms McNamara, is the question of the second lockdown, autumn, early winter 2020. We've heard a lot of evidence in the last few days about that, about indecision, about Boris Johnson and his government not taking the scientific advice, much of which was eerily similar to the advice that had been given earlier in the year. We've heard references to trolleying, to chaos, to dysfunction. There's a passage in your statement where you, I think, try and crystallise your thoughts about this. That's page 90 of your statement, paragraph 183. If we pick it up about 8 lines down, it says, the Prime Minister rarely accepted that to govern is to choose. He really did want it all and changed his mind often. The decision-making swung between two extremes, the Prime Minister's undoubted liberal instincts and then the extremes of shutting everything down, when in reality all of the discussion and debate and choices were in the middle. Taking it shortly, what were your reflections about the experience of the second lockdown?
So I'll start with this point. I think by this stage, it's become really clear to me that the advice from the officials who are supporting the Prime Minister and his ministers in taking these decisions is uncomfortably close to everybody, to the political decision making. And I don't say that's not a party political point or anything else. It's that if you are people working and trying to work for a Prime Minister who is changing his mind a lot, and if you want to make sure the right thing happens, and so you tailor your advice ever closer to where he is to see if maybe you can get even closer and maybe get him 50% of the way to something that, is better than nothing. What you are not able to do is say this is 100%, well, you can't even say it's 100% of the right answer, but there was just they were far too close to having to kind of, I think I've called it ride the tiger here or something, far too close of having to actually stay with what was a quite politicised environment in terms of it was about what was acceptable and what was the right political thing, as opposed to the thing I think would be better in future circumstances if there was a bit more insulation between the people who are giving the advice to the best of their ability, laying out all of the facts, and then allowing ministers to decide. I appreciate that will be uncomfortable for lots of other reasons, but I just don't think there was sufficient insulation between those teams at that point. And that is absolutely not to criticise the individuals involved, but it just all got too much kind of swirled together. And so I don't feel those sorts of structures gets the best from the civil service. I think that it was just extraordinarily frustrating to see some of the same patterns emerge in March. And part of that was because by then we had a whole load of new, fresh people. And so at this point in time, I had resigned from the civil service, but I was determined I was going to stay as long as possible to manage as much of the winter as I felt I could, partly because of my experience early on. And one of the things that was really challenging about doing that, and I can see when I go back into my own record that my tone becomes even more kind of anxious and worried and firm about what we should and shouldn't be doing, was because we had new advisors, we had different political team in Number 10, we had civil servants who hadn't been around in March, some of whom made the mistake of thinking that everybody who went before sort of wasn't as good as them. And that's an easy thing to think, but there was a horrible kind of repeat pattern that was going on then. And that decision-making was way too political. And I don't think there was the space for the civil service to be its best self.
Ms. McNamara, thank you very much. Those are all of the questions that I have for you.
Could I ask just one question, Ms. McNamara, before we let you go? If I can get it out. The relationship between special advisors and senior civil servants. Mr. Cummings, I think in his written statement, objected to his being called a chief of staff by some people.
Yeah.
There isn't a chief of staff. You spoke to about somebody who was a deputy chief of staff earlier.
Yes. So Mr. Cummings never wanted to be called chief of staff. I remember that. I think he thought that, well, I can't remember now, but he wanted to be called senior advisor or something. There's no question in anyone's mind who was the Prime Minister's most senior political advisor. It was him. I think, but I'm sorry, I can't remember. I think Ed Lister might have had the title chief of staff at that point, and the Prime Minister absolutely and definitely relied on him. And Ed Lister had much more operational experience of government and of how things worked. So in practical terms, Ed was really helpful on particularly the autumn lockdown and managing. Ed did much more the operational implications of the decisions that had been taken, and I think that Mr. Cummings did much more of the ideas, I would say. I don't know how helpful that is.
Special advisors presumably are meant to advise. They're not decision makers, or
they're absolutely meant to advise.
But they can instigate areas of inquiry, can they, and research?
They definitely can. So and Number 10 has got more political advisors and civil servants together. It's two parallel groups, which is unusual compared to departments. In theory, special advisors are not supposed to be able to direct the civil service. I think at this time that was very, very, very theoretical. What kind of keeps us all anchored safely, constitutionally, if you like, is that the special advisor is normally working for the Prime Minister or on behalf of the Prime Minister. So if I think back to previous times, I would be very clear when I was asked to do something by a very senior advisor in Number 10, they were asking me on behalf of the Prime Minister. And that was not clear at this. And that's one of the other things that's problematic, is that it wasn't asking on behalf of the Prime Minister, it was asking separate to, which the wiring of those systems doesn't work if that's what happens.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. McNamara. Extremely grateful to you, and sorry we've kept you here for so long.
Don't worry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lady, we'll move straight to the next witness, Dr. Halpin.
So, my lady, can I call Professor Halpern, please?
do solemnly,
sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could you give us your full name, please?
Yes, I'm David Halpern, Professor David Halpern of the Behavioural Insights team.
Thank you. Well, firstly, thank you so much for attending today and assisting the inquiry with its investigations. A few things by way of preliminary matters. If we can both keep our voices up. Secondly, speak slowly so that our evidence, your evidence, can be captured and my questions can be captured. And if we can avoid, if we can, over-speaking, because it doesn't assist with the transcript. You've helpfully provided a witness statement dated the 19th of May of this year. We can see it in front of us. And in relation to that, it runs to 65 pages, and you've signed that at page 63. And you've had a chance to refresh your memory in relation to that. And can you confirm that that is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
As you indicated, you are here on behalf of the Behavioural Insights team. You're now the president. When you drafted this statement, you were the chief executive officer. And you're here to provide an overview of the role you played on behalf of that organisation during the COVID pandemic. It's an extensive statement. We can see at the top right-hand corner 105 exhibits, and even those are quite substantial in themselves. It traverses many issues. We're not going to cover them all today. The first point, of course, is that your statement and those exhibits go into evidence. So we have that, and that assists the inquiry. But I want to focus upon 4 areas, 1 main area and 3 secondary areas. The first area is really touching upon your background, which we will in a moment, and what the Behavioural Insights team is. Secondly, at the heart of your evidence, focusing upon your involvement, particularly in February and March 2020, assisting and advising those at the heart of government. Thirdly, understanding and compliance of social distancing from a behavioural perspective, bearing in mind your expertise in that field. And lastly, we'll conclude and touch, and I emphasise touch upon what you describe as COVID missteps when we look at lessons learned. Is that okay?
Yes.
Professional background, and again, forgive me for perhaps dominating the strike and speaking so much at the beginning, but I can perhaps deal with this quite shortly. We see it at page 2. Forgive me, at paragraph 4, we see your background initially, that you, as we know from your title as a professor, you're an academic with a lifetime tenure at University of Cambridge, and you've held posts at Oxford and Harvard. And we can touch upon when you first worked in government, and from 2001 to 2007, it's at paragraph 3 of your statement. You, on loan from Cambridge, isn't it right, that you assisted the former Prime Minister Tony Blair as the chief analyst in the Prime Minister's strategy unit. So you were there for roughly 6 years, and from there, you became the founding director and research director of the respected independent think tank, the Institute for Government. Is that right?
That's correct.
And we're familiar with the organisation, and we've had a number of reports referred to, and indeed we've had evidence from Alex Thomas already during this inquiry. Thereafter, once you finished at the IFG, you became a director of the Behavioural Insights team in 2010, 2014. Did you set it up?
Yes, so I went back, it's quite unusual perhaps, to Downing Street in 2010 to do a range of things which the then Prime Minister David Cameron was interested in. That include behavioural science, actually also include things like his interest in well-being or other aspects of public service reform.
Yes. So you've had experience with Tony Blair, David Cameron, and before we turn to Behavioural Insights team, you also mentioned your experience in What Works group. Perhaps you could briefly explain what that was.
So what works, I mean, one of the themes may come through today, is the idea, it's a simple question, what does work in government and policy and practice? And so it was to try and drive a more empirical, if you like, evidence-based approach to government. So I took up this role a day a week, essentially at the request of the then Cabinet Secretary, Jeremy Hayward, as the UK's What Works National Advisor, which I did for 10 years pretty much.
So for perhaps a number of decades, in fact, you've had access to and advised Number 10 in relation to these matters.
Yes.
Let's turn to the Behavioural Insights team, also known as the Nudge Unit. Formed 2010 as part of the Cabinet Office, and what was its purpose?
So in the words of the coalition agreement, it was to support people to make better choices for themselves. In more everyday speak, most government policy issues concern human behaviour, be it public health, trying to live more healthily, paying taxes, getting people back to work. When you look at it, most public policy issues concern human behaviour. And the strange thing is there wasn't much expertise in government about that. So it was set up as an experimental team, very small, 7 people, to try and introduce that kind of expertise into government. We actually set it up with a 2-year sunset clause on the basis of if it didn't work, and it probably wouldn't work, then it would automatically be shut down.
And the sunset clause wasn't exercised because it continued within Cabinet Office until 2014, and then it was positioned outside Cabinet Office. Isn't that correct? And then in due course it became independent, a completely independent entity.
That's correct, which is what it is today. Essentially, because it was seeming very effective, we were receiving requests from many other governments and other parts of government to help. It's quite complicated to receive money from another government as part of Downing Street, and so it was felt it was better to set it up in this semi-independent and then eventually fully independent form. And
during COVID, you were at that semi-independent stage.
That's correct. We were co-owned formally by the Cabinet Office, and I also did a day a week directly as National Advisor.
Okay. And in relation to the work the Behavioural Insights team did, it was advisory. It had no decision-making power. And you said I'll summarise what you say in your statement in relation to this, that it received inputs from multiple government departments, and you would supply notes, run experiments to help predict behavioural responses to policy options and take part in policy or analytical discussions. Moving on to our second topic, and again, the main part of your evidence that I want to draw out today is how you became directly involved in the response. Mm-hmm. And we see it at paragraph 18 of your statements that you became formally involved on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day. That's when you were called upon. Chris Wormald, the Permanent Secretary at Department of Health and Social Care, called upon you. And is this a fair summary that over the next month that you were drawn into more and more meetings closer to the heart of government?
Yes, I think broadly it is. The request came, as you say, directly from Chris Wormald, the Permanent Sec at DHSC, but inevitably, even in order to our core work, we needed to understand what was the transmission mechanisms as understood, what are the other policy issues, and so we were therefore pulled into other meetings, including in Downing Street and Cabinet Office.
Rather, adopting your phraseology of what works, the picture from the statement is that you were asking multiple questions of multiple people trying to find out what the problem is and how to find a solution.
Yes, when we originally built the Behavioural Insights team, we also built it on the back of what had been the strategy in it. In order to affect someone's behaviour, you need to figure out what is going on, what's the cause of the behaviour, but also in the case of COVID, what's the transmission mechanism? So how is it being spread if it's on hands or if you're coughing? So it leads to quite practical questions around what exactly is going on in order to be able to answer it. And of course, this ranges from every aspect of first line of defence when you've only got public health issues like washing hands, through to when you move into you want people to take a test, but will they turn up? Will they stay at home if you ask them? And even when you have a vaccine later on, a vaccine, of course, is not a vaccination until someone physically turns up and says, you can stick it in my arm. So
pausing there, because there's a huge amount of work that you did, and you summarised that you ran 57 online experiments, 4 field experiments, and you provided 41 policy notes and were involved in 8 longer projects. So a substantial body of work you were involved with over this period of time. In relation to the work you were doing, was it on a UK basis? Was it England? Was there any consideration of the boundaries between England and the devolved administrations?
So a bit, our commissions mainly, and in fact, you can see the main headline just summarised there, because we need them, of those bodies of work, those studies,
Yes.
was mainly Department of Health, sometimes Cabinet Office, because we still had a core contract with Cabinet Office. I don't recall any direct commissions from Scottish Government. We did do some work in Wales. We did sometimes get commissions from local government, Manchester or whatever. I don't recall doing stuff in Northern Ireland. So mainly centre government in UK, Westminster.
Thank you. And in relation to the scope of your initial instructions back in February 2020, and we can see that at paragraph 18 of your statement there, that initial meetings with the Permanent Secretary and in due course Matt Hancock, but your scope really there was to assist with the behavioural aspect of how the public would engage with the government's response to COVID. And we see provide advice on how the government would communicate COVID-related messaging so the public recognise the severity of the virus whilst avoiding public panic. Sounds very easy when you read it out like that, but it's actually quite a difficult balance to provide information, but also not to commence public panic. Is that fair?
Yes, quite so. We had, of course, previously worked on some other crises in government, not least fuel crises, where some of you may remember, my lady may remember, you had a minister who said, well, just fill up a jerry can. And of course, that led to mass panic, everyone filling up their cars and the whole system crashing. So yes, on the one hand, you want to inform the public, not least about what can they do to protect themselves and their family. On the other hand, of course, you want to avoid panic. Generally, you don't have panic, actually, but you can see in this case, of course, a legitimate concern.
Yes. So one of the first public messaging programs you were involved with was no regret public messaging was the type of messaging you were involved in.
Yes. Well, so our belief has always been, if we're asking the public to do something, people have many other things in their lives, let's make sure that it's authentic in the sense that it's going to work, going to do some good for them. And early on when there's uncertainty, particularly your attention is drawn to so-called no-regret messages, which you're pretty sure will be good things, generally do no harm almost for sure. So hand washing became very rapidly, even by the time we were engaged, had been highlighted as an obvious thing to try and slow transmission. So yes, that would be an example of a no regret. It's hard to think of examples of washing your hands doing much harm.
No, I can't think of one. But in relation to that hand washing, that was a considerable amount of your work, I say the organisation's work, during those early days in February and into March. Isn't that correct?
In those very early days, yes, that's correct. And maybe it's an illustration we can use for a minute about the nature of the work that we would do. It might seem an obvious thing. Many of you would have seen the posters, so those green posters with the hand. It's still up across Britain. So if you think about your challenge, someone's going to look at that for a few seconds. And the question is, how can you get as much information across as possible in that poster? So, you wouldn't dwell on it, but what we would do is we would literally test, and we did test, variations in posters, variations in messages with thousands of people and say, well, you see it for a few seconds, like in the real world. What did it say? Could you remember? If you can't remember 5 seconds later, it's not likely to be effective. Would you intend to do that? Would you wash your hands? So we would test that, and essentially, by testing variations, you can tune and improve it so that the final one that most people would have seen had gone through, you'll see you have in the evidence, a number of iterations which would increase public comprehension. So it's even a trivial example, if you looked at it across, you would see the message gets simpler, the words get bigger, some of the confusion disappears. Do you need the NHS brand or government brand? Is it just distracting you? The image, the early images were quite a confusing image. It was, what was it? It was actually hands on a rail.
So just pausing there for a moment, so, conscious that it's a product of a huge amount of work you've done.
Yeah.
And it's an illustration, is it not, that evidence-based decision-making takes time and a number of iterations to perfect the message.
It does take time, although a key issue is not as much time as you think. I mean, those things were assembled with experiments with thousands of people over days, not weeks or months. And it's a key question in our view is about there are lots of these practical issues which are critical to effective policy or delivery, which actually you need to handle in that empirical way.
In relation to your involvement, we can put hand washing to one side. That work was still ongoing, but your involvement expanded, and you're in touch with Professor Whitty on the 18th of February, asking the questions you alluded to already in relation to COVID transmission mechanism. And again, very briefly, what was your understanding of COVID transmission at that stage on the 18th of February?
So Chris very generously helped us, and we had that early briefing, particularly to understand what was the transmission mechanism. So again, it might seem trivial, but if you think, for example, it's airborne, it's maybe different than if you think it's so-called fomite. When you cough, it's on a surface,
yes,
right? If you think it's on surface, then you're going to spend a lot of time cleaning surfaces. If you think it's in the air, it's a different strategy. So he took us through what was understood about the virus, his understanding of those transmission mechanisms, and therefore to help us work out what were the points behaviourally that you might be able to introduce to reinforce, support people to slow down the spread of the virus.
And moving on to the 20th of February, meeting at DHSC, and you were examining government publications, and we can see this at paragraph 23, in fact, of your statement. So another meeting, one of the many you attended at DHC, it was to go over a government publication online, and the issue was around the level of detail to include so that people can be warned about what's going to happen and the range of possibility of what might happen. At the bottom of that paragraph I just want to focus upon is this: the strong expectation in the room from the medical experts on the 20th of February was that the wave would be unstoppable once community transmission occurred, i.e. once the contain phase was left. Is that right?
That is correct. I mean, of course, I think we know a lot about behaviour, but we're not medical experts, and therefore we are very much relying on it. But that was very, very strongly the impression. Well, graphs on the wall and so on.
So was the impression from your understanding that it was a matter of not if, but when this virus is going to be unstoppable once community transmission occurred?
Yes, that conditionality being important, but yes, that in that time still people, I think, were hoping, if not expecting, that it would be possible to contain the virus through the work of Public Health England and others. But yes, at once it got out, more generally, that it would be pretty much unstoppable, and therefore the implication was mitigating the negative effects rather than being able to contain it.
And at that stage, bear in mind this meeting with the caveat, but were you content that the publication sufficiently represented the risk to the public as understood at that time?
I'd have to look back at it, but I think it was pretty straightforward that the implication, if you read it, a lot of people were potentially going to die. And indeed, there was specific discussion about the inclusion of the numbers of deaths in previous pandemics, not least so-called Spanish flu, but it introduced a reference point about the seriousness of the situation. And there was discussion whether to include that. And our view was, well, people need to be correctly calibrated about what the risk is. Not afraid, but correctly calibrated. So it seemed a sensible thing to do.
I'm going to use a different phrase, not calibration, but did you have any concerns that this information was cutting through, that there was sufficient public awareness of the risks around that time?
So this is late February.
We're 20th of February. This is before your meeting in due course on the 25th of February, just before Lombardy becomes more high profile.
So I didn't think it was way off, but in the days to follow, and as you know, I talk about actually had to be away for work, and particularly returning in late February, I was pretty surprised that we were not seeing posters and profile. But remember, on the 20th, you're still talking about contain, and therefore it's very small numbers. You're really relying on PHE to try and do their job, and everyone hoped that, like SARS or previous issues, it would be contained.
Let's move on to a meeting you had with Dominic Cummings and Ben Warner on the 25th of February. We can see that paragraph 25. Ben Warner being a data scientist who we're going to hear evidence from next week. And it was a meeting on non-COVID matters, as it happens, but you say here we took the opportunity to compare notes and share concerns. So by this stage, the dreadful events in Lombardy were in our consciousness. We could see what was going on the televisions and the dreadful loss of life which was beginning to emerge over the days in Italy. What concerns, if any, were expressed to you by Ben Warner and Dominic Cummings at this meeting?
So I don't think Dominic Cummings was at that meeting. I think it was only Ben from memory.
Forgive me.
It was a meeting, as indicated there, primarily looking out. Remember, Ben had been brought in to try and increase the kind of quantitative mathematical data science capability in Downing Street. So a lot of it we were talking about that in general terms. It's actually my memory. But I'm sure we were starting to talk in this period about, well, what are the data flows? What is the modeling? Is it good enough? And so on. I actually remember Ben Warner at that stage, you can ask him directly, was quite upbeat actually about the modeling and its quality, which was a sort of a good comfort. Yeah.
So a touch base.
Yep.
Alive to what was going on in the wider world, but no significant concerns at this stage.
Well, remember, a lot of normal government was still carrying on at this period.
Yes.
And we look back and we could see the whole story, but at that point, it hadn't really hit in force, certainly in the centre of government.
And it's what we're interested in is your perspective and your experience as you had interaction with central government. On the 26th of February, the next day, this isn't a government interaction, this is when you attended a Royal Society seminar, and we've heard evidence from the president of the Royal Society. And this was a seminar to discuss quarantine as it related to the current COVID outbreak. You recall attending that meeting, that seminar. What impact, if any, did that have on you?
Well, because this is the work on COVID was starting to really take over my life and many others, but it was particularly, we were really still trying to understand the transmission mechanisms in detail. You know, we were very interested in the detail because we're trying to, guide people. You want to guide them to what's effective. So, even a simple example would be, I touched on this issue about surfaces, and the guidance was being assembled. Well, do you need everybody in schools to be cleaning every floor or not? Like, is that relevant? Is it not? There was particular work, so James Rubin, who I know you've spoken to, had done an absolutely excellent review on quarantine, looking at the evidence and the extent to which that people would sustain quarantining behaviour over long periods, to which his general conclusion was yes. So we were very much in sort of sponge learning mode still. What can we learn about, these mechanisms, previous analogous behaviour? Also on the medical side, what's your best understanding on these transmission mechanisms? So the last thing we want to be doing is telling people in campaigns to do X, Y, Z, but it's not going to be effective. Yes. We want to direct attention, it's a precious thing, to things that would actually make a difference to help people protect themselves and their families.
And this work and this information finding is in a context when there's discussion in broad terms regarding quarantine and testing and obtaining better data. Is that right?
Yes. We were very interested in testing and data, and we can talk about that later, but if you want. But yeah, every aspect of it. But even you mentioned testing. Let me just introduce why behaviourally we would also be interested in it. Of course, you want to know about how a disease is moving through a population or not. and build up where's your best place to put your testing if you've got limited capacity. But you also want to look at its behavioural capacity. So if I'm going to say, you need to quarantine now, Mr. Keating, for the next 2 weeks, will you do it? Are you more likely to do it if we said, you need to take this test and it looks like you've got COVID? Well, you can imagine what the answer is, but it's an empirical question. Or even, it may be too soon to say, we want you to quarantine for 2 weeks, but a week in we'll test you, and then that will confirm. You see what I mean?
Okay,
so these the behavioural consequences.
Thank you. I'm just
Continuing with that subject.
There was. I can pause there, because I'm conscious that we've been going a long time.
Well, I've just had a message. So
Yes.
If that's okay,
Thank
right?
you.
I shall return in 15 minutes.
Thank you.
Mr. Keating.
Thank you, my lady. Professor Holpern, we're going to deal with the topic of SAGE and how it came about that you were at a number of SAGE meetings. In the timeline, the 27th meeting, you were at number 10 at a meeting in a cabinet room which was chaired by Matt Hancock, dealing with a number of the issues and pinch points. And as a result of that and your dealings with Patrick Vallance at that time, you were asked by him to join SAGE. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes, in the wake of that meeting.
And what was the rationale for you being asked to join SAGE?
Well, of course, you can ask Sir Patrick Vallance. It seemed there were two main issues, I think. One is I'd mentioned to him about some modelling work we thought was very good, particularly linked to Hannah Fry, the mathematician, a simulation of a spread of a coronavirus, which we thought had some very powerful insights in it. We were also very interested in details of the transmission, as I explained earlier, including the extent to which behaviours would protect both individuals and populations. So Sir Patrick was very keen that there be one voice, one view on this, and so he encouraged, in fact asked me to join SAGE meetings accordingly.
And we know that you, from the 3rd of March to the 23rd of March, you were at 6 meetings, the first being on the 3rd of March. Then on the 5th of March, the second meeting you attended, your summary of this, which I'm going to read very briefly, is that it considered how to communicate in a way that would be effective and would not panic people. That theme continuing. The 10th of March, your view of that meeting, as summarised in your statement. At this stage, there appeared to be a view within SAGE that COVID was an unstoppable wave and containment of the virus would not be a viable option. 13th of March, the next meeting you attended, and this is the one where your concerns crystallised and you describe it how the penny dropped, and we'll refer to that shortly. And then there's 2 more meetings you attended on the 18th and 23rd. But after the 23rd, your invitations to SAGE ceased. Mm-hmm. Any particular reason why that was?
I actually don't know. I did ask Patrick once, but SAGE, its membership can change, and it's for the government, chief scientific advisor to decide. It essentially, when it went online rather than in person, I didn't seem to get the invites anymore. But we was pretty busy doing other work, so
which you said out in your statement.
Sir Patrick to decide.
So next subtopic is herd immunity. We've heard a lot about it. You've had some involvement in this, and I just want to touch upon your understanding of that strategy from your contacts with those at the heart of government. You had contact with Neil Ferguson on the 28th of February, and you had obviously contact with both the Chief Scientific Officer and the Chief Medical Officer. And what was that understanding in late February of the strategy?
So, of course, it had been was then expressed in the published document on 3rd of March. Essentially, it was contain if you could, and then you mitigate, and that was it. As you say, I, not uniquely, was getting increasingly troubled about that, I suppose, because we felt there were viable ways of doing sophisticated suppression, but essentially the presumption was, on all quarters it felt, from a convergence of different medical views, the modelling, the position on vaccines, the practical experience of the CMO himself, was that once essentially community transmission had started, it would be some version of an unstoppable wave, yes.
And in relation to the term herd immunity, you yourself utilised that phrase, you used that in the BBC interview on the 10th of March, which you set out in your statements. And this had followed on from the 3rd of March stage meeting, where it was unstoppable. And you refer to that interview where you made a comment about the potential need to cocoon the elderly and the most vulnerable in the weeks to come. And you referred to the phrase herd immunity. At that stage, why did you refer to the need to cocoon the elderly and vulnerable?
So I should explain, the interview was primarily actually talking about the science behind, we talked about a moment ago. Hand washing, but more generally how you'd apply it. The interviewer, Mark Easton, at the end asked a question, and I responded, probably shouldn't have done, around essentially the vulnerable. And I said, partly because, of course, it was in all the meetings, it was in the media, self-evidently there was this massive difference, 5,000-fold at least, in the age-infected fatality rate. And so it was pretty inevitable, it seemed discussed in Sage 2, of course, but that we would want to protect the most vulnerable. I used the phrase cocooning because it's the one used in the literature. I think Mark Easton asked me the question about 3 times, which should have been a warning sign, but and on the 3rd time I said we obviously need to cocoon, protect people until, in general population, herd immunity or whatever had been achieved. So
sentiment, to use your phrase, was an authentic one. The need to cocoon.
Yes, exactly. You were going to need to protect the most vulnerable because it was screened from 10,000 feet. And the phrase herd immunity was being used very widely, and it was probably a mistake on my part to have used it in that interview, is the truth of it.
But you were contacted by Number 10's communications, not Lee Kane, it was somebody else in that office.
Yeah.
And you summarised how there was no issue with the use of the term herd immunity, but you were pulled up about using cocoon. Is that correct? Cocooning.
Yes, it was specifically Jack Doyle, I remember, for a hairdryer treatment. They were very angry about it, but they were particularly angry about the word cocoon. My memory of it was because the word hadn't been used in public, particularly, and they didn't really want to get into that issue because it hadn't been talked about publicly as a policy issue. If you remember, there was issues around if you had, if you got symptoms that you might be asked to self-isolate, but none of the stuff around what later became shielding had been discussed in the public policy debate.
So 10th of March, unhappiness that you were dealing with cocooning / what became shielding.
Yeah.
But herd immunity, okay.
Yes, I mean, it was just very widely used in all the internal discussions as a shorthand for not government policy, as often discussed, but that it would likely arise over time.
I want to move on to our next subtopic, behavioural fatigue. We've heard a lot about it, and it's been in the public domain.
Yes.
And you refer to this in your statement, and we should see this at paragraph 64. And in fairness to you, we need to address this. So on 2 occasions, the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Whissey, deals with this, the 9th of March and the 12th of March, and really talks about sustainability and how people will understandably get fatigued and it will be difficult to sustain this over a period of time. And we can see the other reference about enthusiasm at a certain point starts to flag on the 12th of March. And he will give evidence in relation to that. But the first point is this. It's been suggested in the past that you and your organisation were in the shadows, the source of this advice. Is that correct?
So I'm glad to get this clear. We were not. It's not a phrase that we had used. Not only was it not from us, but also, as you'll know privately from the emails, we were pushing pretty hard to move forward on social distancing measures by that point. Chris Whitty, I think I've read his statement. He's pretty clear about where it comes from and describes it as a mistake on his part. But yeah, it was unfortunate.
Did you relay to him at the time that it wasn't the right phrase from a behavioural scientist perspective?
I don't know if I did. He had lots of other things. I did send him a paper a few days later, which I think is in the evidence.
This is about the Spanish flu.
Yeah, which was essentially to look at some work on as far as it had occurred during Spanish flu. The main point about the paper was that even in those very difficult circumstances, you did not see this so-called fatigue. This is particularly in America, it was studied, American cities. Only by the time you got to the second and particularly third times you had lockdown, did you see anything akin to people really starting to give up on it. So
we could go to that document if you wish, but is this a fair summary? That it gives that information, it's a discussion point, but it's a little bit ambivalent in terms of providing express advice that it was the wrong thing to say, behavioural fatigue.
Yes, but James Rubin, others, and Spivey, as you will know, there was an avalanche coming towards Chris to say, what are you talking about? It's particularly in the context of novel behaviour, and when everybody is moving together, our strong view, you mentioned the quarantine work also, was that people would comply to a high degree, and so it was, was misleading to imply that behavioural science was saying that. And indeed, as again Chris Whitty has spoken about in his statement, he unfortunately gave the impression that that was a reason for delay, which was not his intent, I think. And of course, from the Sage minutes, you'll know, was not what was being said in private.
Next topic, change in strategy and your experience of this. Timeline, we've dealt with the 10th of March, that there was a view about COVID being unstoppable and containment was no longer viable. You mentioned already just a moment ago that you had raised concerns on the 12th of March specifically. You raised concerns regarding the limitations of SAGE modelling in an email to Chris Wormold, Patrick Vallance, Chris Whitty, Jonathan Van Tam. And you say this, we are at the limits of what modelling can tell us. And then we see a pivotal meeting, my words, not yours, on the 13th of March, SAGE meeting. And my terminology, but would you agree that was a significant meeting, the 13th of March?
It felt to me that it was. I felt both the content of the discussion and the emotional tone in the room, there was this realisation that something was amiss and policy had to shift.
Well, let's explore this realisation that something was amiss. So, key SAGE meeting, you recall there was a graph of an infection wave over time with a red line to represent an NHS capacity, with the objective, the key objective, to keep the wave under the red line in line with the mitigate delay messaging. And you say that there was different understandings of capacity, the red line, number of beds, number of ventilators. Is that right?
Yes.
Is it the case that during the meeting that Stephen Powis, who is an NHS director, and Patrick Vallance questioned the modellers on why they were so sure that suppression of the virus in line with what was being done in China and South Korea was not viable? That's your paragraph 73. So I'm reading out to your evidence. Is that what the position was?
Yes, so my memory is Steve Powis specifically raised it. Again, my memory is very much following on from what you just said, which is that there seemed to be confusion over what was the capacity in that red line. I mean, difference between ICU versus serious cases, threefold differential, etc. And that this wasn't a small problem, it was a big problem, and the implication was the numbers and models you've been using, it'll be overwhelmed. So that, I think, prompted Steve Powis to say, so why are you so sure that doing stronger measures, a lockdown, would necessarily rebound? Why is it a bad thing to do? And Patrick Valence picked up on it and said, yes, that is a really good question, and pressed the modellers to answer.
And the modellers here are Professor Medley and Professor Edmonds, SPIAM. And what was their response to that pressing or probing, as you described it?
So they were very definite. They are modelling experts. But what struck me again in this moment was they said, Graham particularly, absolutely sure, 100%. And one of the things I would teach at Cambridge was statistics. And you just think nothing's 100%, certainly in the uncertainty of models. And it troubled me really deeply because I felt that, 99%, but 100%. And it encapsulated for me in a moment this overconfidence in aspects of the models.
And in relation to that overconfidence in the modelling, you mention in your statement this confusion regarding NHS capacity and other issues such as the low level of testing capacity and ambition. I presume the low level of ambition. What did you mean by that when you refer to ambition in your statement?
So as many things were gone through in that meeting, another one, as you say, was testing capacity. I remember, I think my notepad had recalled it as, they said they had 1,000 tests a month on serology, 1,000 a month. And I think I'd scribbled, why is so few? 1,000 a week, we should be doing 1,000 a day. We're so far off the pace. So now you've 3 major concerns piling up in this meeting.
Just pause there, thank you. All these concerns, great concern, you described it, overconfidence. And you referred to your notebook and you were making a number of notes, but what you did write was that we are not ready. Is that correct?
I did, and indeed wrote it in capital letters. It was so striking.
We can see it there. And a number 10 colleague leaned over, crossed out your entry, which we see at the bottom of the page. And what was written instead of "we are not ready"?
We are fucked.
And that was written by your colleague, a number 10 colleague, is that right?
That's right, Ben Warner.
Ben Warner.
Yes, who I believe you're talking to.
So in graphic terms, reflecting the meeting, concerns regarding overconfidence, did that reflect the concerns? Readiness for the unstoppable wave that was about to come?
Yes. I mean, remember the one play that you had in the strategy, as was expressed to us, I think, was that you can shape the wave, as referred to endlessly, you could flatten it, etc. And you were trying to do it to stop the NHS being overwhelmed. But in this meeting, you're hearing evidence that on current trajectory, it is going to be overwhelmed, that we don't have the testing ready. The models seem overconfident. There's a lot of grounds for concern. And so hence, I really felt quite shocked and depressed. I felt that, it's not our role to do all those things. We're working on the behavioural aspects to...
Just pause there, and it's my fault. I think we're both going to have to slow down a little bit.
I'm sorry, yes. Apologies.
Nope, I speak fast at the best of times. So if we can try and slow down a little bit, and I've interrupted you, so you'll forgive me. You said that you were feeling quite shocked and depressed. It's not our role to do all those things. We're working on the behavioural aspects. Is there anything you wanted to add to that answer?
Yes, so the overall sense was that, as in my notebook, we, the country, the policy world, is not ready for what is unfolding. And I felt that, on people's faces in the room, that there was some realization of it, a sort of cracking in the confidence.
Cracking in the confidence, the penny has dropped, is how you describe it. And you say in your statement that others in the room and you felt that we should have been pursuing suppression strategies. Is that right? Paragraph 74.
Yes, that's right. There's a key question of what suppression means, but basically...
I think we've heard quite a lot about that, so
yes,
we're okay.
But yes.
So post-meeting, going through this chronology, difficult meeting, you were in contact with Matt Hancock, who you've had worked with alongside for a number of weeks to update him, and you describe how you felt that, how you spoke to him and said, that the penny has dropped, that we really need to do something about suppression and locking down. And what was the response?
So, yes, I had, I think, texted or WhatsApp Matt. He had called me back. I was surprised, I suppose. He said along the lines, I said, this was the best news he'd heard all week. Best news in a very specific sense, which is that there was this realization that strategy might need to change. Something more dramatic might have to be done in order to really slow the spread. So I was surprised by it, but of course I wasn't in all the meetings he was.
No.
But yeah.
Not the most natural response to a bad news message, but your impression was that he felt stronger and more immediate action was necessary, and we could not just wait for the unstoppable wave.
Yeah, my sense was for ministers such as Matt Hancock, others were much closer in their centre of number 10, but they were dutifully following the science and were very uncomfortable with where it was going. So there was an appetite to be stronger in the policy moves, but they were waiting for the signal to be told that's what we need to do. And so that's why he experienced it as a good thing that realization was coming through.
You say later in your statements that, in particular for Matt Hancock, in your view, he was quite frustrated and was ready to act more decisively. Is that right, at that time?
That was my sense at that time, yeah.
So in relation to those concerns, we don't need to turn to it. You set out in your statement how between the 16th and 18th of March, you sent several emails to Mark Sedwill, Chris Wormold, Dominic Cummings, Jeremy Farah, in advance of the next stage meeting, expressing your concern and the need to consider a global lockdown to shut down the virus. And that was something that you were in correspondence with, isn't that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And on the 18th of March, we know that, as you set out in your statements, that you argued for lockdown in the meeting.
Yes, bear in mind that I had already, before the 13th, had written to say, in fact, literally wrote a list of what we would now call lockdown-style measures, slightly softer. But yes, at this point it was, why aren't we going full-blown? I was not at that time aware. I've read Patrick Valance's statement that there were meetings that had clearly occurred in between those two meetings. So in that sense, we were in our lane, maybe not seeing the whole picture. But yes, I was really concerned that we needed a very decisive decision.
Yes. Well, you put it very well. You're in your lane. We've got other evidence, which we have, and that's why I'm dealing with this quite succinctly. There was one point I wanted to draw out, was at paragraph 93, you describe on the 23rd of March an email with Tim Loining. Am I pronouncing it
Tim
correctly?
Loining.
Who is at HMT, Her Majesty's Treasury, as I understand it, and there was this emails between you, and you expressed a view that the modellers in SAGE seem to have a remarkable thin grip on the depths caused by externalities. In other words, from behavioural or system side effects, such as people being too afraid to seek treatment for other conditions.
Yes.
And that's something which you had identified at that stage and raised.
That's correct. I mean, we'd crawled over the models quite carefully. And Neil Ferguson had been kind enough also to let one of my team go to Imperial, look, as it were, behind the curtain of the models.
Yes.
So we were, at this point, maybe less confident, therefore, but this is one of a number of issues. For the specific thing, which comes in force later, if people aren't going in large numbers in to get medical treatment, then you get a lot of excess deaths or illness as a result of that. Tim, I think, had written to me about some of his concerns. He was an advisor to the Chancellor. And I put him in touch, if I remember, on that with the government's actuary, who, of course, were experts in some of these questions.
Yes, thank you. Our third penultimate area, and it's a short one, is understanding and compliance with social distancing from a behavioural perspective. Again, comprehensive statement, you deal with this. Impact of senior officials' breaches. And really want to touch upon this from your expertise as a behavioural scientist. From a behavioural perspective, you described the Dominic Cummings incident as very unhelpful at paragraph 140. And why was that? Why was it unhelpful in your view from an expert point of view, not an opinion point of view?
Yes. So people are very influenced by what they see others doing. We'll sit here quietly in this room, partly taking the cues from each other. In this case, in everyday speak, people are more influenced by what they see others doing than what the formal rules are, sometimes known as declarative norms. So littering would be a simple example. You are much more likely to litter in a room that already has litter, and literally experimentally tested. So there you've got a high-profile figure, on the face of it, pretty blatantly breaking the rules and justifying it, seeking to justify it. So it, was extremely less than ideal. If there was any thing to be positively to be taken from it, is that data generally suggested that most of the public were complying and continue to comply, because what mattered more was those people around you, your neighbours, your fellow workers, your commuters, were fortunately more important than what someone in Downing Street was doing.
Pausing there for a moment. So an issue which mitigated by other behavioural factors which may affect an individual, but you describe it from a behavioural point of view as an almost textbook example of what not to do. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was atrocious.
And later on in your statement, you say it sort of blew a huge hole in a rule-based approach and undermined the credibility of Her Majesty's government in what was asking or demanding of the public.
Yes. So I don't know how much detail you want to go in on this.
I was just going to draw that out, unless
right.
there was anything else you wanted to say in relation to that you considered to be key.
Well, let me just put a marker down that rule-based, frameworks on behaviour are brittle. You follow the rule. If you don't, you get punished. They're different from a principle-based set of guidance, which are more flexible. Having gone down the road pretty heavily of a rule-based approach, when you get a breach on it, you can't wriggle and worm. You have to say, hands up. So it's quite a profound issue about how you set up your framework, your approach, and what that means, what you're saying to the public in terms of affecting behaviour.
Yes. And it undermines public confidence.
Yeah, well, it blows a hole in it if you just break the rule and then try and wriggle out of it. Yeah.
Next topic relates to the work you did for the Department of Health and Social Care, a study between late spring and autumn 2020 into the public's understanding and compliance with social distancing guidelines. You looked at local alert levels and whether people understood the level of alert in their area, i.e. is that tier 1, tier 2, tier 3? And the outcome of that report, which may not come as a surprise, but what did that study reveal?
The public were very confused. The rules were getting more complicated. They were struggling to remember what they were. They might not know which tier they're in. And so we would test this. We were testing it periodically. And many of the public didn't really understand the rules. And this, in some ways, got worse and worse. It relates to this issue, actually, of rule versus principle. So if you're going down the rule-based approach, all kinds of questions about, well, can I go out? Can I meet people in the garden? Will that be okay? Can I share a car with someone? A lot of rules to remember, as opposed to some other countries had gone down a principle-based approach. So the Japanese would be an obvious example, the 3 Cs, avoid crowded areas, avoid, etc. So it gives you a general sense of what's dangerous, and it's for you to interpret.
Let's pause there. Thank you. And finally, on this heading, you deal with a number of programs in your statement and their behavioural effect. You talk about the Stay Alert programme, and you say this: arguably the UK tried to have its cake and eat it, and sometimes ended up with neither. Stay Alert was an example of this. Why was the Stay Alert programme, very briefly, so bad in your view?
It tells you to worry and doesn't tell you what to do. The worst combination. Is that short enough?
It's very short.
Very good.
Thank you. But no, it's very helpful, thank you. Especially when we're talking about communication. The next programme was Eat Out to Help Out. And again, you've done work in relation to that in parallel. And is it the case that the research you did was that COVID-secure premises was a more evidence-based approach which would encourage behaviours? That probably is a very simple summary for a complex study.
That is correct. From memory, I think we did the study for Bayes, again using this experimental approach. So maybe it's helpful to explain it again. So we would show several thousand people and we'd ask them, thinking of a restaurant you liked, would you go back there? But what we're doing is we're showing different people a different variation. So sometimes you'd see, is your favourite restaurant, and there's a picture of the waiter with nothing on their face, but other groups would see the waiter with a mask or with a COVID secure. And we also asked them about, if we paid you £10 or whatever, would that, So we're setting up different conditions to try and work out how it would influence someone's intention to go to the restaurant.
And again,
very clear result.
Yes.
That people were very strongly influenced by anything what you might call COVID secure. The mask, the safety, this is the rules for the restaurant. I think 20 odd points more likely, percentage points, to go to the restaurant. In contrast, paying people was quite a small effect, I think 6 percentage points. So it was a very powerful result, we thought, because it tells you that if you get that COVID secure system in place, not only more people could be confident to go out, it's also reinforcing good practice of COVID secure environments. So you'd pay a premium to go to a restaurant with your mother, maybe you do that anyway, but in this case, for COVID, whereas if you're a bunch of 21-year-olds, you might not care so much and you'd go, as it were, for a less secure environment.
Thank you. So in relation to this, financially cheaper and with less risk of transmission if you went down the COVID secure route.
Yes.
Last point on this section is one of your looking ahead steps, and we know that we shifted in the rules over this period of time. You say this: don't go for simple, rigid rules if you think it's likely you're going to have to vary them or have limited ability or intention to enforce them.
That's correct. So it builds on the earlier point
Yes.
about rules. So the worst thing to do is say this is the rule, and then you can see all around it's being broken. I hesitate to say this in a room of lawyers, but the classic example is if you see a wall and it says no ball games, the first thing you might think is, well, that's a pretty good wall. And as soon as you start to break the rule, essentially you become a rule breaker. So you really want to design rules that are generally followed. You want to enforce on egregious breaches, but you don't want to inadvertently signal lots of people are breaking the rule, because it will actually make it even more likely that others will follow suit.
Thank you. A lot of information there, and we're dealing with it at a high level. It's more detail in your statement, and again, I'm conscious of not wanting to do justice to these important principles. Let's move on to the final area, which is lessons learned, COVID missteps. In July 2020, you set out a number of opinions and criticisms on the initial response to the pandemic from a behavioural perspective in a document entitled Institutional Lessons from COVID. And you've explained that was a hard copy letter initially sent in July. It's Helen McNamara and Alex Chisholm in the Cabinet Office. And later, is it a case that you were asked for that copy of the document again and you updated it and in September 2020? Let's have a quick look at that. So it's INQ 000129093. And what I summarised can be seen in the top right-hand corner. And it runs to 13 pages approximately. It's a significant piece of work in itself, forms your evidence and warrants to be read and considered in its entirety, which it will be and has been on this side. So I'm not going to go through it sequentially. I just want to draw out 2 points, 2 significant points, which is this. You describe the early misstep, and we can see it at paragraph 1. Overconfidence and anchoring in our expert medical community led to a presumption that COVID would be like a flu-like wave, blinding it to the pursuit of near suppression as a viable option, and expanded tracing system in particular. Our decision-making was vulnerable to systemic error. And if we could go to page 2, please, where you expand. This is your executive summary. You expand upon this. And I'm just going to find the right reference. It's the second last paragraph. You say how this was built into the... Just pause there for a second. Next paragraph, thank you very much. In fact, it's the third paragraph, arguably the most fundamental misstep. Forgive me. You said this presumption was built into the contain, delay, mitigate research strategy. It also underpinned the early Chris Whitty position on test and trace and the balanced view on herd immunity, brackets later airbrushed, close brackets. It'd be remiss not to pick that up now. What do you mean by the last remark, herd immunity later airbrushed, in that communication in July 2020?
Well, you'll be getting evidence from many people. Patrick's been pretty clear on it. I think within government communications, there was definitely a de-emphasis on the herd immunity language and the way in which the early strategy, I think, was expressed. I think others can argue there was continuity, but it did feel there was a significant recalibration or description of it. Yeah.
After the media and public backlash around the 13th and 14th of March.
Yes, and arguably, again, possibly for you to determine rather than me, but a recalibration of the policy. I mean, I might just say that the key point actually was a slightly different, a subtle one, which even, of course, having now had the benefit of reading Sir Patrick's own reflections, is he does talk about, even in his evidence, of course, the best thing to do would have been to have a much better test and trace system and so on. But that is actually a part of sophisticated suppression. That is what the South Koreans did. That is what Singapore did. That's what many other countries did. And we didn't do it. We weren't doing it in February. It wasn't on the table. And it partly itself links to another issue in this document, which is the how. How would you do it? It's the boring mechanics of how would you find out, have a better contact tracing system, built at scale, and so on.
So on the relation to how points, which is operationally, one of the points you make is that there needs to be thought as to how to deliver strategy and follow up and explore the questions and really examine under the bonnet what needs to be done.
Yes, exactly. It's the very practical detail.
Yes.
If you say in a model, we want to reduce social contact, a host of questions immediately follow. How, who, what? How would we do the detail of it?
Yes.
Sorry, it talks slow.
2 points I want to draw out. You were invited into SAGE. You were at a number of meetings. You were watching and expressing concerns from the margins and then from the centre regarding what was happening and asking questions.
Yeah.
You say in your statements that your view is that yourself and others were quietly dismissed as not understanding the science. Is that correct? By some, perhaps?
Some, not all, but yes.
And your phrase anchoring was mentioned at the outset. Anchoring groupthink is the similar phrase used, but you mentioned that this was at the heart of one of the missteps in that early response. Is that right?
Yes, and on a number of issues. Anchoring essentially means you have a strong prior and you find it hard to move from it. So humans in general, it's a behavioural effect, tend to seek confirming evidence for their priors. We're not as good at seeking what's the counter evidence, and in particular in this case, saying what experiment, what piece of evidence would answer the question. So that's why earlier on I mentioned you can do experiments very fast. So if you've got a question, does it work, does it not? The puzzle becomes how fast can I answer that question?
Second point I want to raise, and the final point, is the negative impact of overconfidence is something you mentioned in this report. And you refer to previous detailed work you've done on decision-making in government, and the headline is, beware overconfidence. Mm-hmm. And you say this, perhaps if we could bring this up. This is page 3, please. Second last paragraph, I think. We'll just leave it there for a moment and I'll just make sure I have it. Yes, second last paragraph, third line from the bottom. Ironically, the pride in our science and our capabilities, that being the UK, slowed our ability to learn lessons from other countries. Under cover of variations of it's very different there was an arrogance that we knew better and would do better. That's your words, which you set out in this report and sent to government. Is that right?
Yes, I did feel that was true. So the report, Behavioural Government, looks at this. It shows, for example, generally, as people become more senior, their overconfidence generally gets bigger rather than less. I did feel it characterised a lot of what was happening from early on, so those very early comparisons to other countries, Japan, Germany, and it made us slower to look really carefully at what they did and learn the lessons from them. It also had many other manifestations. I mean, masks would be an example. We felt that the evidence became very compelling, certainly by late March, early April for masks, and there was a strong anchoring in scepticism in many of the medical community.
And linked to what you say in your report, and the final point for me is you say in your statements that there was a touch of hubris, that paragraph 167.
Yeah.
We perhaps don't need a touch of hubris that we knew better and we would do better, alongside criticisms of how badly other countries were doing. That's a view that you formed at the time. Is that the position?
That is so, from even February. And I should be clear, because this note was written privately, as it didn't. The last thing we want to do was undermine key figures. On the other hand, to learn the lessons. So yes, there was a sense, I'm sure it heard elsewhere, that we were lucky almost to have the best team in our senior figures, and there's no doubt they're extremely talented, brilliant people. But that can also bring a lacuna with it of overconfidence, and particularly maybe less openness to other aspects, which is the engineering, the how, the detail, of course the behavioural too. So yes, and we could be wrong, of course. We could be totally wrong that even if we'd gone for it, really gone for it in February, could we have built a South Korean or Singapore system? Would the public or ministers wanted to do it because of some of the intrusiveness it would have implied? But we feel we didn't deliver on that. And there were really a lot of examples of the slowness of the system, which was then manifest with really great consequence.
Thank you. Professor Halpern, they're all my questions. I'm grateful for your patience. My lady, there's 2 co-participants you've granted permission.
Mr. Mennell.
Good afternoon, Dr. Halpern. ask questions on behalf of a number of children's rights organizations. And I just have a few questions for you on a discrete topic. At paragraph 126 of your witness statement, you mention that in the summer of 2020, the Behavioral Insights team was formally commissioned to participate in a Cabinet Office-led social distancing review alongside Patrick Vallance, Chris Whitty, and others. Is that right?
Yes.
And that review was a substantial piece of work, was it not?
Fairly substantial, yes.
In the sense, at least, that its report was published by the government a year later in July 2021. Yes?
Yes.
My lady, that report, as far as I'm aware, is not on the relativity system, but is available on the government's website. Dr. Halpern, that report, published in July 2021, does not make any distinction, does it, between the differing differing impacts of social distancing rules on adults and children. Can you assist as to why?
I can't recall the detail of it. It was, of course, the main point of the report was to look at whether you could, for example, relax the 2-metre rule, replace it with, substitute other equivalent issues. But you're right, of course, there would be particular issues for children, playgrounds, etc., other activity. So forgive me, I'm happy to look in more detail, but I don't recall the extent to which children were discussed. I don't remember it as a major theme, but I'm sure you know better than me.
But I mean, just on that, I mean, I suppose there are a number of possibilities. I mean, it could be an issue in relation to the terms of reference and the scope that government had set, or it could have been because of how the behavioral impacts team, chose to prioritize the issue of social distancing rules. I mean, I don't know, if you can't help on that, please say so, but that's really what I'm trying to get at.
I'm not sure much more I can add on the specifics, but you're right. I mean, there are many groups, segments one needs to consider, including children.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the 2-metre rule. I mean, were you aware, for example, that at approximately the same time that this review is being commissioned, in July 2020, Scotland, as an example, exempted children under 12 from the social distancing rules, whereas England did not. Were you aware of that?
I can't remember the timing, but again, you clearly are on top of the detail.
Well, again, and you may not be able to help on this either, but can you assist as to why this review, which, as I said, took a year to complete, did not explore this, I suggest, significant difference of approach vis-a-vis children under the age of 12 between Scotland and England?
I mean, I could be wrong, but I think it didn't. The work was done in a much more compressed way than a year. It may have been a year before it was published, but my memory is that it was done on a relatively short period of time, in the context that there were real concerns, for example, on the economic impact, many of the impacts on people's lifestyle of especially the 2-metre rule, and that the language was often used as, could you identify, for example, 1 metre plus or an equivalent way of achieving the same reduction in transmission that would be less harmful to people's lives, to the economy, and so on. So that was I think the primary objective of it. It was, my memory of it was done on quite a compressed time period, to be honest, so that the impacts were done. Yeah.
But that, what you've described was the priority, as opposed to, for example, the fact that adults and children behave differently, and social distancing rules obviously impact differently on adults as opposed to children. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, I don't doubt that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Jacobs.
Dr. Halpin asked some questions on behalf of the Trades Union Congress. Do feel free to continue to look forward if it's uncomfortable. Could I start with page 30 of your statement, and in particular paragraph 132? I think it can be brought up on screen. What you say under the heading of financial incentives is, we thought there was a strong case for using some financial incentives to support people to self-isolate when identified as having COVID or having been in contact with a case. A specific concern was that low-income and less securely employed individuals were being put off testing and isolating, given the impact on their financial situation. Firstly, Dr. Halpin, why was it thought by you and the Behavioural Insights team that there was a strong case for financial incentives?
So as we touched on earlier, we were looking a lot at not just comprehension, but compliance, whether people were able to follow the rules, self-isolating and so on. And we would then look at certain groups who were saying they weren't going to comply and ask them why. And one factor was, of course, financial. In fact, I wrote a detailed note to Dido Harding, it's mentioned at the end of the evidence statement, I think, at early June, suggesting one of a number of things. I think it was 2 on the list. Was we strongly recommended producing more financial support to those who couldn't afford it. I mean, for reasons that will be plain. If you're a Uber economy, driver, and you're going to lose your income, that's a pretty big deal and difficult for you. So how are we going to support that person?
Would it be right to say in basic terms that that's not just an absence of an incentive, there's actually a powerful disincentive for compliance which needs to be addressed?
Absolutely, absolutely.
The correspondence on this issue, which you describe in these paragraphs of your statement, relates to the latter part of July 2020. Had you been aware in the period sort of mid-March when self-isolation comes to the fore as an NPI and the end of July of any determined sort of focus and thinking about this issue of incentives for self-isolation?
So yes, we had raised it, of course. There was further work. I think there's one of the bits of evidence is with Gila Sachs, was asked to do further work on it. And of course, others such as on SPI-B had raised the issue too. In fact, we were concerned not only that financial support be given, but the way in which it was given too.
You describe raising it. Was there a receptive audience?
My memory, and I think it's in some of the evidence, was that our sense was that the Treasury were resistant. That is the Treasury's job, to be resistant to spending money. But we found it, our sense was they weren't easily persuaded for a more generous funding package, although, of course, one was put together by I think September, you may know.
Yeah. Well, let's perhaps look at some of the evidence on that. Could we have up on screen 129090?
Yeah.
So we have an email from you of the 28th of July 2020 addressed to some officials in DHSC and also the Cabinet Office. And second sentence is, we're also looking at the financial incentives issue for Simon Case right now to see if we can move CX. Is that Chancellor?
Yes.
Whose starting position is quite sceptical. Just pausing there. So had there been conversations between you and Mr. Case about this financial incentives issue, about the Chancellor being sceptical?
I don't recall talking to Simon about it. I definitely did not talk directly with the Chancellor, but there were many officials. Also, I think, I'm trying to see, Claire Lombardelli, for example, was on the social distancing review, a senior Treasury official. So, yeah.
Your email continues, the risk is that the national campaign, if in doubt, get a test, due for Thursday, could be dogged by this lack of support, especially in key target groups. Just briefly, what in general terms are the key target groups you're referring to?
So those individuals where we saw, or groups, much lower compliance or likelihood to come forward for a test. So that particularly, we did a lot of segmentation to identify risk. That might be someone who was, for example, in an occupation which was in a lot of contact with other people. A classic example was a taxi driver, but whose income was very insecure, and so they were quite,
Mr. Halpin, would it be correct to say that in broad terms you're thinking about groups where compliance may be low?
Yes, particularly, yeah.
But perhaps also transmission may be high or higher risk?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. At the end of that email, or the last paragraph, you say lots of questions remain about which form of incentive or support would be maximally effective. My gut feeling is that HMT will be hard to move to statutory sick pay change, but could be persuaded to go for an Australian-style hardship fund administered by local authorities. Was there a particular reason for your gut feeling that HMT would be hard to move on statutory sick pay change?
So from memory only, it would be because it would have a lot of, in economic term, dead weight costs. So it would be very expensive. You would be paying a lot of people for whom they probably would have complied anyway. Whereas something which was more akin to a discretionary hardship fund, especially we'd suggested built into the test and tracing system. So when you were saying to someone, it looks like you need to isolate, because do you need support, and then be able to offer it straight away.
Were you aware, or did your team do any sort of extensive work on the relative benefits of using the statutory sick pay system as against a hardship fund?
I don't recall detail. We did, in the gap before this, try and design, as you'll gather, one of our ways of working was to figure out how would you answer that question, literally to run an experiment, for example, in a local area. We didn't win that argument, but we did, as mentioned in this email, identify as it were a natural experiment, which in care homes, which we felt was quite compelling evidence to reinforce the case that for low-income but very important workers, it was important to offer that financial support.
A few moments ago, you referenced the fact that a scheme of sorts was brought in. It was obviously more or less along the lines of the hardship fund administered by local authorities at the end of September. Was your team asked to do any work about the effectiveness of that scheme, for example, reviewing whether it was effective?
I don't believe we were asked to do so. We did write some work on it, particularly, again, around compliance issues, my memory. We can dig that up for you. So a particular issue we worried was not only about the scale of the money, but how difficult it is to get it. So if you are someone on a low income and we say, you need to self-isolate, by the way, here's a load of paperwork, you have to go to someone else, hopefully it'll get sorted out. That's not great. Much more important to be able to say, do you need support? We'll give you that support right away.
So just pausing there, Mr. Halpin, those are clearly important issues generally which go to the effectiveness of the scheme.
Yep.
Is your evidence that work wasn't done, at least by your team, as to whether those sort of concerns were adequately addressed in the scheme as it was introduced?
I don't recall if we did experimental work on it. I do recall we wrote notes about the issues, flagging them, suggesting further work.
And final question, you've given evidence about your observation of the 13th of March that we are not ready, or other chosen expletive. Do you think it's a symptom of being not ready that it's not until late September that a scheme is introduced addressing something as important as incentivising self-isolation?
I do, and I realise we're at time, my lady, but perhaps I could use that to make the more general point. So yes, it was way too late. We'd raised it much earlier, not the only ones. But it was part of a pattern, in a sense. Lots of good people trying to do the right thing, but your good intention in policy or with scientific evidence, you have to translate it into practical systems approaches. You know, will the money work? How difficult it will be? The app was similarly. We thought the app was absolutely key. We were very concerned from day one of the first lockdown, was the government ready for the end of lockdown with the kind of tracking systems, etc. The app was due, we were promised, in 2 to 3 weeks. It was 6 months.
Dr. Halpin, could it be put this way, at least in relation to the self-isolation support? It's all very well and good having the idea of self-isolation. But if one doesn't think carefully through the practicalities of how to make it work effective, then it's not much use.
Yes.
Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Jacob. That completes the evidence for today, Mr.
It does, my
Keating.
lady. Thank you.
Well, I hope you won't deny me my free will, Professor Halpin. So on that note, thank you very much for your assistance. And we shall resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.